everyone, welcome to this Python tutorial. In this tutorial we're going to go over some basics of Python programming, and the way we're going to do that is we're going to program a little card game. So maybe you came here because you've completed Hello World and you're thinking, okay, what's next? How do I get better? Or you just want to learn how to program a card game or set up a card game that you can use in basically any other language. The principles will be the same. So I'm going to show you how to basically set up a card game so that you can customize it and use it for any sort of app or program that you want to. So since this is a Python programming tutorial, the first thing you want to do is check to see which version of Python you have, or if you have it installed at all. And what you want to do is open up a terminal window if you have a Mac, or a command window if you have a PC, and just type in Python -- version, and that'll print out the version of Python that you have installed. I also have Python 3 installed, so for those of you that are up to date with Python 3, so I have version 2.7 and version 3.64 installed. So the one I'm going to be using for today is Python 3, so you'll see me using that Python 3 command to run all my files. So to get started, we're going to use some basic object-oriented programming and with Python. And so to start a Python program, all you need is your favorite little text editor. I'm using a text editor called Brackets. I like some of the features in it, so I'm going to open a new text file, and there we go. We're going. So first thing that I'm going to do is, I know that when I create these cards, I'm going to use the enum class, which is basically a symbolic representation where you create names of different objects and you bound them to certain values. So what I'm going to do is from enum import enum. All right, and then I'm going to go ahead and save this as a file that I can use. So save this in whatever I'm going to call this playing card tutorial.py. This name doesn't really matter. You can name it whatever you want. Just make sure it's descriptive enough for you to recognize. But this extension .py tells the computer that it's a Python file. So that part is important. So make sure that whatever you do, name it .py. You have a .py extension. Okay, save that, and we're rocking and rolling. So now the next thing we want to do is we're going to create a playing card class, okay? And this is going to house all of our basic playing card information. So to do that in Python, we use the class keyword, and I'm just going to name it playing card. Okay, so that's the syntax that you use for Python. And then within this playing card class, there are a few different things that we're going to want to do. Let's go ahead and add some comments just to keep ourselves organized. Class to hold information for playing cards. Beautiful. Okay, so we know that playing cards have basically a value, so 2 through ace, and they also have a suit, so spades, clubs, hearts, diamonds. Okay, so within our playing card class, we're going to create an init function, 2 underscores there, and what we're going to do is we're going to pass in the class. We're going to initialize with the card value, and we're going to initialize the card suit. Okay, and then what we're going to do is say self.card. So this is going to be the 2 through ace value that I was talking about. and we're going to set that equal to the card value parameter that we passed in the class. Okay, so we're passing that in from outside, and we're setting the class instance variable card equal to whatever parameter we're initializing with. So again, we'll do the same thing for the suits. Okay, and that's it. We basically set up our playing card class, and that's all we really need for now. So the next thing we want to do is we want to think about a playing card deck and what that actually has. So like we said, it has a suit that is spades, hearts, clubs, or diamonds, and it has basically a card value, which is 2 through ace. And so the way we're going to represent that in the program is we're going to use the enum library. All right. And the way to do that is, again, using the class keyword. So we'll start with the suit. Suit enum. And then we're basically just going to create the enums for the different suits of cards. All right. One more. There we go. Okay. Add another comment. Beautiful. Because in 6 months from now, when somebody goes to look at your program and they don't know what you've done, or you don't know what you've done, those comments will help identify what's actually going on. All right, and then the next thing we're going to do is we're going to create a card enum, but we're going to do this one a little bit differently, and you'll see why a little bit later on. So go ahead and start it the same. So it's going to be a card, basically 2 through ace value, but we're going to use an int enum. Okay, and before we continue, add an import for the int enum. Go ahead and save that so you don't lose any work. And then I've already typed these out, so I won't make you watch me go through every single one of those. The only difference with this one is that we're setting these card values equal to actual integers instead of strings here. All right, so before we go any further, let's go ahead and run this just to make sure there are no issues. So what you're going to do to run this is make sure your terminal is in the same directory as your Python file, and then you can use the command python and then the name of your file .py. Okay, so remember to include the .py extension, and if it runs, you won't see any error messages. If you see some error messages, try to decode them as best you can, Google the error, and figure it out. All right, so now what we're going to do, well, before we continue, let's add a quick comment here. This is the card enum for our playing cards. Go ahead and save. So now we've basically we have the building blocks to create a playing card game. We can create a whole deck from what we have right now. So we have the 4 suits, and we have the values for all of the cards 2 through ace. So the next thing we want to do is basically deal out a full deck or create a full deck of playing cards. And what we're going to do is we're going to create I'm just going to call this a full deck list. So initialize your list to be empty. This is going to be the entire deck of cards that we use and deal out. So all 52 cards. And the way we're going to do that is with 2 for loops. So we're going to loop through, for each of the suits, we're going to add all of the card values All right, which means 2 for loops. So for suit in suit, where suit is the enum that we just created, and for card in card, the card enum that we created. And then what do we want to do? Well, we want to add a playing card to our full deck, right? So we're going to append, but what we're going to append is we basically want to create a new instance of the playing card class, right? And so the way we're going to do that, playing card, and recall the parameters that we're using for our initialization. So we need to pass in a card value and a card suit. And conveniently, we have created those enums so we can pass in the card, all right, which corresponds to this variable here, and the suit, which corresponds to that variable there. Okay, go ahead and save that. Go ahead and run this really quickly to make sure there are no errors. Playing card is not defined. Ah, there's a typo. We don't want that L to be capitalized, so change it to a lowercase l. There we go, because we were trying to create a class using playing card with a lowercase l, and I accidentally had a typo there. So go ahead and fix that, run it again. There we go. Okay. So now what I want to do is basically print out this full deck and just check to make sure that all of the cards were created properly. So what I'm going to do here, there's a couple of ways I could do it. I'm going to go ahead and create another for loop. So let's go ahead and create a for loop and print out 0 from 0 to length of, well, our whole deck. Okay. And then full deck at I dot card. Okay, and then let's print the suit. Full deck at I dot suit. Alrighty. Let's see if that'll run, and it does. Okay. So let's do a quick check just to make sure that that our creating the deck worked properly. So we've got 2 of spades, 3 of spades, 4 of spades, 5, 6, all the way up to ace of spades. And then we do clubs, 2 of clubs, 3 of clubs. That looks good. Ending with ace of diamonds. So diamonds was the last suit enum we created. Everything looks good. Okay. So now we're going to do a little bit of reorganization. You can keep this print statement if you want. I'm going to go ahead and delete it just because I know it's working properly right now. So I'm also going to create a function here to actually deal and create this full deck of cards just for organization purposes. So what I'm going to do is create a function called createDeck, and within that function I'm just going to put this for loop. Okay, so I'm going to call this function. It'll deal out and create the full deck of cards that I need. add a return there. Okay, because otherwise, if you don't add this return statement here, the full deck will only be changed within this function. So you return it so that the variable we created earlier will actually change in the entire program. And let's add a comment. Function to deal full deck of cards. Great. Okay, now let's go ahead and do a quick run. Looks good. Okay, beautiful. So now what we've done is we've dealt out a full deck of cards, right? So now what we need to do is figure out a way to turn this deck of cards into something that we can use for an actual game. Because right now, if you remember, it's basically a brand new deck, unshuffled, and we can't really play a game with this because that'd be a boring game if everybody was getting royal flushes for every single poker hand that you dealt. So what we need to do is figure out a way to draw and deal out basically random cards within this deck. So the way we're going to do that is we're going to use the random library from Python. Okay, so let's go back up to our top, add another import from random import star. Okay, so this will give us the ability to choose a random integer, and we're going to use that to deal out random cards for our games. Now, of course, there's many different ways that you can do this. I'm not saying this is the best way, but this is certainly an easy way. It works for me. So if you have a different way of doing this, good for you. Have at it. All right, now we're going to create a function to basically return a random card from our deck. And before we do that, when we're drawing cards from a deck, remember the number of cards in the deck will decrease by 1. That's pretty obvious. And so we don't want to be drawing from this full deck here because that's sort of our original deck of full cards. So what I'm going to do is create another list and call it partial deck. So this is going to keep track of the cards that we've been drawing from, so the remaining cards. And then what I'm going to do is create a function down here called draw card, okay? And I'm going to pass in a deck of cards as a parameter. All right, and this basically what I want this function to do is just return a single random card from the deck, okay? And the way I'm going to do that is say, I'm going to call this variable random card. Rand card is equal to, I'm going to use a function called randint, all right, and that's from the random class in Python that we just imported. So randint, and I want the range of this to be from 0 to, well, the length of the deck, okay, -1. This function is inclusive, okay, so it'll be return a random integer between greater than or equal to 0 or less than or equal to the length of the deck -1, okay? And then what I want to do is return, so remember, deck is basically one of these decks that we're passing in as a parameter. And what I want to do with the card, the random integer that I'm returning, I want to pull that card out of the deck, and the way I do that is with the pop function. So that'll remove it, but also return the value that I'm removing. Now let's add a quick comment here, just to keep ourselves organized. Draw a single card from deck. Perfect. So now what we can do is actually start building the basics of our program for an actual game. So now that we have all the building blocks in place to deal a single random card, create a full deck. So what we want to do, so first we're going to create our deck. And then what we want to do is, remember this partial deck that we created a little bit earlier? We need to set that, initially that's going to be set equal to our full deck of cards. So after we create the full deck of cards, what we're going to do is use the list function in Python, which basically creates a copy of this list and sets it equal to this partial deck. So now our partial deck is currently equal to our full deck, which is exactly what we want. And now what we can start doing is drawing single cards from the deck. And before I do anything, what I'm going to do is actually test that our random card pseudo-random function randint is actually working and returning a random card and not just the first or the last card. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say create test card. Okay, so this is just for testing purposes. We're going to delete this line later. Is set equal to our function, and I'm going to pass in the partial deck of cards. Okay, remember we don't want to be using this full deck of cards for anything because that's our original unedited, unshuffled deck that we're going to keep the same throughout this program. So then what I'm going to do is just you drew a and print out. I'm going to print out, I want to print out the card and the suit, and that's it. All right, let's go ahead and run that. Let's see if it works. I drew a 4 of clubs. Perfect. Let's run it one more time just to do a quick check. 4 of spades. That's interesting. Suits are different, but the card is the same. Could be a coincidence. What do you think? King of hearts. Looks like we're doing okay. If we keep running, looks like we're getting a somewhat random combination of card and suit. So that's good. I'm going to go ahead and call this good. So now that we know that our random function is working properly. What I'm going to do now is show you an example of what you can do with everything that we've done so far. So how can you turn this collection of functions into an actual game or into an actual program? And I thought of a simple example, and perhaps the easiest game to play with a deck of cards is probably War. So you just have, in a standard game of War, you have 2 players. They're each dealt half the deck, right? And then one player at a time flips over a card, and whoever has the highest value card takes that card. Okay, so basically the algorithm for this particular game, half of it is already in place since we have a full deck of cards. We can deal a single card to a certain player, right? And then from there, we just have to develop the actual gameplay. So like I said, these 2 lines were just for testing, so let's go ahead and delete them. And what I'm going to do is create 2 new lists. So I'm just going to call this player 1 cards. So that'll be our first player, and player 2 cards. Okay. And for different games, what you could probably set this up differently so that you ask how many players there are. You could type in player names. There's 100 different ways that you could sort of customize this to whatever you need it to be. But I'm just showing a quick and easy way how you can do it and make this customizable for pretty much any card game that you want to write. So now what we need to do is we need to deal out the cards to each player, right? So we're going to create a function deal war. Okay. And basically what we want to do is just give each player a random card until our deck is empty. So they should each have half the deck. And we're going to do that with a while loop. So while the length of partial deck, remember this is the deck that we're drawing from, so the number of cards will decrease each time we draw from it. So while the length is greater than 0, so while there are cards still left in this deck, player 1 cards, we're going to hand player 1 a card using our function here. So we're going to draw a single random card from the deck. Okay. And again, the parameter we're passing in is this partial deck of cards here. Okay. So every time we hand player 1 a card, our partial deck length is going to go down by 1. Player 2 cards dot append, same thing. Draw a random card, pass in the partial deck as a parameter. Okay. Add a comment for organization. Deal 2 players for the game of war. Brilliant. Let's run this. Make sure everything's okay. All right. So partial deck. Now let's go ahead and call our deal war function. Run it again just to make sure. Everything seems to be working okay. Perfect. Now the last thing that we need to do is just develop the algorithm for the actual gameplay for the game of war. So we've dealt both players the cards, and now we just need to have them compare each card and go through the actual gameplay. So the way we're going to do that is we're going to use a for loop. So this is just a quick and easy way to do it. There's probably better ways, but for right now, this will serve our purposes of just illustrating how you can do this. Just a simple example. So I'm going to use a range from 0 to what? The length of one of the decks. Okay. And then what I want to do, so remember earlier how I said we wanted to use an integer enum for the card values? Well, that's going to come in handy when we need to compare these for the game of war. So if the player 1 dot card is greater than player 2 card, let's do this. We'll add a print statement. Player 1 wins. The hand with let's print out the card. Dot card. We're also going to print player 2 loses with player 2 cards. Dot card. Okay. And let's see. What's our other scenario? Well, player 1 could win the hand. Right, so we'll do a little shortcut here. Switch our inequality. So if player 1 loses, then player 2 wins the hand with player 2 cards at I dot card. Perfect. And player 1 wins. Nope, player 1 loses this hand. Perfect. Okay, But there's also a third scenario. If neither player 1 nor player 2 has a higher card. Let's see. What's the third scenario? War. All right. So now I know in war you're also supposed to take the other player's card, and if you'd like you can go ahead and set that up yourself. I'll leave that as sort of a your own homework. So let's run this and see what happens. All right, looks like we've got a game of war going here. So the first line, player 1 wins with a jack, player 2 loses with a 4. Okay, that makes sense. The second round, ooh, we had a war. That's exciting. The next round, player 1 wins again with a jack, player 2 loses with a 5. Man, player 2 is not doing so good. All right. Then we had another round of war. Then player 1 wins again with a queen versus a 7. Another round of war. Oh, player 2 wins the first hand with an ace. Very nice. Player 1 loses. Okay, so you get the idea. That's a really simple example of how to program a little card game in Python, and this can easily be extrapolated to create a game of poker. You know, if you wanted to, you could create another enum class. So if you were going to do poker, what you could do, for example, is class poker hand. All right, and I imagine this would you would want to make this another enum. All right, so you could do a pair, right? And the values here don't necessarily correspond to actual card values. So we can sort of set these equal to whatever integer we want. Pair, what's next? 3 of a kind. Okay, so you get the idea. And then we could do 2 pair, so on and so forth, all the way up to royal flush equals, you know, whatever number of poker hands we have total, 9, I don't know. So you get the idea. And then you could add in a good number of players and really create a nice little card game app out of the basics here. All right, so have fun, enjoy Python, and go create some card games.